So I think we should start.
Okay, fine.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Aditi Kakkad, an integrated MSc Chemistry student at University of Hyderabad, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Junior Science Club for today's webinar. So for today's talk, all of us will be going to hear a very fascinating story. The story of an element with the atomic number 94, which was named after the dwarf planet Pluto. Yes, we'll be getting to hear the story of plutonium. And how better it could be to have our honorable speaker, Professor C.V.R. Brahmananda Rao, to join us for a talk today on the occasion of National Science Day. Professor C.V.R. Brahmananda Rao is the Academic Dean of Chemical Sciences at Homi Bhabha National Institute, Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research, Kalapakam. Professor Rao is an alumni of University of Hyderabad. He did his master's in chemistry from the University of Hyderabad and got his PhD from IIT Delhi. Currently, Professor Rao is the head of Solution Chemistry, Mass Spectroscopy Division, Fuel Chemistry Division, Material Chemistry and Metal Fuel Cycle Group at the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Rao to start the talk. All these participants can drop their questions in the chat box, which will be addressed by Professor Rao at the end of our talk. All the participants from the YouTube live stream can drop their questions in the comments, which will be addressed at the end. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Aditi. Is it audible? Is it clear, Aditi?
Yes, sir, it's perfect.
Fine. Okay. I think first and foremost, I would like to thank Aditi and Sara for giving me an opportunity to talk to you all on this occasion of Science Day, which we mark every year, which we celebrate every year as a day to inculcate scientific temper in the people. This also marks the discovery of Raman effect by Raman long ago. So first, thanks to Sara and Aditi for giving me an opportunity, and this is a great honor for me because I'm talking to the students where I was a student once upon a time, long ago. From 92 to 94, I did my master's. Those days, there was no integrated degree as you people have now. I think it's a great opportunity. And one of the best places to learn is HCU. That's what I feel. I did my graduation from Delhi University. But I feel Central University is absolutely out of this world. And we had a great faculty. And I think we have the same good faculty and great faculty even now. And to make chemistry more fascinating, I think we have a lot of young people doing great research also there. So I hope in that way, I feel I am honored to be here on this day to share whatever I know to the people, to the students of HCU and others who are joining online. Okay, fine. So when these people approached me for the talk, I was not sure what to speak. There are so many topics we can speak on this day. But I thought, okay, let me tell about an element which when people say, when they utter the word plutonium, it always gives different feelings to different people. For a politician, it's like reliving the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For a metallurgist, it's a very tough job because if you want to play with plutonium, it's very difficult as we see. For a chemist, it's a great thing because it's very colorful in chemistry. It has different colors. The different oxidation state of plutonium have various colors. It's really great to work with. We do on a regular basis. So it's very interesting. So I thought, okay, let me tell about that. But plutonium is not the only thing which I'm going to talk. I have divided my talk into 3 parts. Of course, I will take only 1 hour. The first part is about the radioactivity per se. Second is the story of plutonium. And third is the applications of some of the isotopes, which we come across on a daily basis, which people are not aware of. Some of the people may be knowing it. So let us get going and let us see what as we go along. And if you have any doubts, please, at the end, we'll clarify that. You can ask any questions connected to this or otherwise. Okay, one of the most fascinating thing happened to mankind is the discovery, which this person envisaged way back in 1869. We know the periodic table. Without periodic table, life would have been a mess. Periodic table organizes the knowledge in a very systematic way. And the idea was there before also. It's not that Mendeleev switch. The idea was first time. But he organized in a very systematic way. Way back in 1869, when he classified the elements based on atomic masses, atomic weights. Just imagine, the concept of atom was not known. We had only Dalton's theories, and beyond that, nothing much. The concept of electron, proton, neutron all came after 1900. So 1869, A person from the remotest part of Russia, Siberia, comes out with an idea saying that yes, we can classify, we can standardize the whole knowledge in a very systematic way, and he arranges the elements and based on the atomic weight. Okay, fine. The piteous part is 1907, where the year he died. He was nominated for Nobel Prize, but he died before the awards were even given. So he missed the Nobel Prize, but doesn't really matter because he is beyond all this. The closest he could reach in the periodic, the Nobel Prize was in the periodic table, where he is placed next to nobelium. So he is that close to Nobel Prize. So what is the elements? We know the elements which make the world, the universe, are classified. So the first major, after 1869, the major organization, the reorganization of the elements happened by this young student of Rutherford. His name is Moseley. He told, because by the time we're talking about 1915, 1912, the knowledge was there, the protons were discovered, and X-ray crystallography was known, X-rays were discovered. So he was trying to use his X-ray apparatus on hitting on the elements and was getting characteristic X-rays. He told the more basic thing should be not the mass, should be the number of protons present in the nucleus. So he revamped the whole periodic table. Now the present classification, the long form of periodic table or the modern periodic table, as we see on the presentation, is based on atomic number. So the big upheaval came when Moseley told mass is not the basic criteria, we should have atomic number as a criteria. And this is the most systematized knowledge you can think of, where we go on adding to the element, people are trying to find new elements. So when you start, if you see the elements, if you see the most basic thing the matter is made up of, first century we had around 7 elements. We know they're all prehistoric. Iron, the civilizations before that, Copper Age, Bronze Age, they're all because the elements played, or metals played such an important role. By the time we came to 16th century, we had around 10. By the time we came to 18th century, it was 23. During Mendeleev time, it was 63. And as of today, it is 118 elements. So this is the classification. You know, as students of chemistry, we classify the elements, you study the properties. And this is the most beautiful thing ever happened to a chemist, and also for a material scientist, or for that matter for any scientist, because using this periodic table you can learn a lot. What type of compounds can be formed, what type of mixture should be used, what type of materials should be developed. So it's a very amazing thing. But the least understood of all these elements is the last row, starting from actinium to lawrencium, because they're not that very commonly available. So my story starts from uranium. Uranium is the last element to be found in nature with the highest mass number or atomic number of 92. And it was discovered by Klaproth way back when he precipitated from pitchblende. Pitchblende was known. They say uranium was known historically, but they never understood what is the element. It was uranium in the form of oxides were used for coloring. Basically, if you see the old churches, you can see the olden material, the vases and the glasses are yellowish in color because they used to add uranium oxide salts. At that time, they were not understood which element were present, but they know that if you take this element and mix with glass, it gives yellow tinge. So Klaproth isolated uranium oxide basically. He thought it's metal, but it was not. So in 1841, another professor from France, Eugene Pelligot, isolated the metal. So you know that Klaproth did was he wanted to reduce uranium oxide by using carbon. And carbon cannot be used as a reducing agent. You require stronger reducing agents like a metal. And this idea was implemented by Pelligot in 1841 when he used uranium salt, uranium UCl4, to reduce with potassium, and therefore he could get the first metal. So 1841 the metal was discovered, but nothing much used. It was an element, but with no much great application except for coloring of the glasses and ceramics. Nothing much. It was not a very great element at that point of time. But the whole thing changed. You see, almost after 1841, he discovered uranium metal. He isolated the metal. The revamping of the uranium life came back in 1896. And the story goes that Henry Poincaré, he was a mathematician basically. He was French Academy he's a member of French Academy. When he heard Rontgen, 1895, 1 year before X-ray was discovered by Rontgen, and he presented his work. So this news was carried out from Henry Poincaré to Becquerel. Becquerel was a mineralogist who was interested in phosphorescence. What is phosphorescence? When the light is exposed to any material, it gets excited to the higher energy states, and it comes back to the ground state, it emits light. That light is very characteristic and he has been working at the University of Paris for a long time on these elements. So when Poincare told that the quantum X-rays, unknown radiation, were discovered by Roentgen, Becquerel was trying to connect whether by any chance it has a connection with the minerals he is seeing, or is there any connection between phosphorescence and X-rays. He thought, okay, let me try to do something. He took uranium salts, and he tried to expose that to light so that there is a electron transition happens from the ground state to the excited state, and when they come back, phosphorescence can be seen. So he did some experiments in Paris, but in one of the sunny day on Paris in February, same time, 125 years ago, of course, we are celebrating 125 years of radioactivity, which was discovered 125 years ago. So he observed that one fine day when the day was foggy, he abandoned to do the experiments. He just put the salts of uranium on a photographic film and keeps inside a desk. So when the next day, after a few days, when the Paris is again light and hot, he wanted to take this salts and expose this to the sunlight, and again try to see the type of radiation if the phosphorescence is working or not. But to his surprise, when he takes out the packet, he sees there's a large patch. That's why the photographic film had a lot of big patch. So that means what? Some radiation were coming out of this even without the light and the so-called phosphorescence. He gets perplexed. What is the reason why it cannot be phosphorescence? And then he works on it and then observes that it's emitting radiation, which is characteristic of that particular element. And he comes with the concept that some radiation is coming out and it has nothing to do with X-rays, and the concept of radioactivity was discovered. So radioactivity is nothing but some of the nuclei are unstable and they disintegrate to their daughter products by giving different particles. We know some of them are alpha. Alpha is nothing but helium nucleus. Beta particle is nothing but a fast moving electron which comes from the nucleus, and gamma radiation. So these are the characteristics. As we go, it evolves. But at that point of time, he comes out with the concept of radioactivity. Of course, the word radioactivity was coined by his student Marie Curie. And Marie Curie was a student, and Becquerel was a guide. They two worked together, and so the concept of radioactivity was known, and she went on to prove that not only uranium but thorium also had some amount of radioactivity, but not as high as uranium. And she goes on to discover radium and polonium. I recommend all of you to read about biography of Marie Curie. It's one of the most beautiful story ever told, where she worked slogged to do her science in the most difficult of conditions. With the support from her husband, she went on to do great things. And the two elements she discovered were radium and polonium. Both were discovered in the pitchblende. So she was working on different elements. After removing uranium, she was seeing that there is still a lot of radioactivity present in the liquid left over. So she goes on concentrating it, doing crystallization, fraction crystallization to get ultimately radium. So she almost processed few tons of pitchblende to get few milligrams of radium. And for that, she was awarded Nobel Prize in 1903 along with Becquerel. And she has she discovered two elements: radium, named after race, it emitted very characteristic radiation, and polonium, named after the country she belongs to. So she was the first person to use the word radioactivity, a material which is emitting radiation as radioactivity. And she's the only person to win two Nobel Prizes in two different fields, physics and chemistry. Of course, protons and neutrons are the most basic constituents. So this way, so just try to see the timeline. We are then you can understand the thread connecting all this. So this is around 1903, 1904. So this year we're celebrating 125 years of radioactivity. And then, of course, protons were discovered coming to 1900s. People have discovered protons, Eugene Goldstein. Then between that, in 1911, Rutherford comes out with a model. He does one of the most beautiful experiment ever known to mankind. Rutherford comes from a very remote place. He comes from New Zealand. You will not have heard any. I have not come across many scientists from New Zealand. Historical, of course, there are universities now. He was a person who came from a very poor family. He worked very hard. He got a scholarship to Cambridge. Works with J.J. Thomson, who discovered electrons. And he is considered one of the greatest experimentalists ever in the last century. Experimentalist, of course, only next to Faraday. Faraday is the ultimate. Had Faraday been alive after 1901, when the Nobel Prize were bestowed, he would have got at least 7 Nobel Prizes. We don't know. Anyway, nobody has got more than 2 as we know of. So after Faraday, they say that the greatest experimentalist was Rutherford. Rutherford, elegantly with his students Marsden and Geiger, he designed an experiment, what we all know of, which you studied in class 10th and 11th, the gold foil experiment, which went on to prove that uranium has, every atom has a nucleus. Thomson gave the plum pudding model, and Rutherford comes and says, no, there is nothing. There is a nucleus, which is the center, which contains protons, is positively charged. He also says that we can't add up the masses, therefore there should be something chargeless material present, a chargeless particle present in the nucleus, which should be accounted. And this went on. So this was again discovered, that neutron was took quite some time, unlike a proton and other things, because it doesn't have charge. The credit goes to again his student again. It's Chadwick, a British chemist who was working with Rutherford. In 1932, he discovers a particle which we call it as neutron now. The beauty is, you see that most 3 basic constituents was discovered by a guru, his student, followed by a student. So Thomson student was Rutherford. Rutherford discovered proton, and Rutherford student was Chadwick, and he discovers neutron. So all the 3 were done by one family, or what you call one group of people who are related to as teachers and students. Now coming back to the story. So the moment neutrons were discovered, there's a lot of excitement actually, because it's a particle which can do many things because it doesn't have charge. The most elegant idea of using neutrons came from this person. His name is Enrico Fermi. They say he is one of the greatest experimentalist and theoretician together. You hardly have anybody who is good in both experiments and theory. The people who are good in theory will be bad in experiment and vice versa. People say the greatest theoretician is Pauli and Dirac. And the great experimentalist, as I told you, was Faraday and Rutherford. But this fellow is a blend of both. Fermi was a great, he was an Italian. He was working in Italy. His idea was, the moment he understood that neutrons are discovered, he took the last available element in the periodic table, that is uranium, and bombarded with neutrons. He was very sure that if I make the nucleus unstable, it can emit radiation and it can go to the next element. So the race was to produce the new elements, to extend the periodic table beyond 92. The last known element is 92. How to do that? If you make the nucleus unstable, I can do the nucleus unstable by 2 ways, either hitting the protons or with the neutrons. Protons were difficult because they are charged particles. The Coulombic forces will not allow the particles to get it. It has to wait till Lorentz discovers cyclotron. So till that point of time, the moment neutrons were discovered, Fermi comes with an idea, let me bombard the elements available in the periodic table and try to see whether I can get the next element. But pathetically, he misses many things. Being a physicist, he was not very sure. He had a group of great physicists with them, not a chemist. So he reports the material. He reports and says, I discovered new element. And for that, he gets a Nobel Prize in 1938, but it's not true. He has not discovered any new element. He missed the nuclear fission altogether, which we will see later. So he gets a Nobel Prize for the discovery which he has not done. But of course, he deserved more than 1 Nobel Prize because he was a great fellow in all respects. You can see that. So he bombarded almost every element in the periodic table. He missed fission, which we will see later. So when the Nobel Committee declares the Nobel Prize, he gets away from Sweden directly to US and works there. So he went on, he has a huge contribution. In fact, he is known as father of nuclear reactors, as we'll see. And the element 100 is named after him, the fermion. So coming back, so 1933, he tried every element in the periodic table in Italy. He could not get. Parallelly, lot of research was going on in different groups. One group in Italy with Fermi, one group in Marie Curie in Paris. Third group is from a German group named Otto Hahn and Lisa Meitner. This was a great pair. Meitner was a physicist and Otto Hahn was a chemist. They discovered an element just few years ago in 1917, the element called protactinium. So if you see 1930s, a lot of research was going on. Irene was conducting a lot of, as I told, the race was to produce a new element beyond 92 to extend the periodic table. So she was trying to do that, but they always found out that when they bombarded uranium with neutron, they were getting lanthanides, which was not expected. And they could not explain this. A lot of issues. They published the paper saying that we are seeing lanthanum, whose atomic number is 57. Barium, they were getting 56 was the atomic number. So they went on trying, they never understood. They thought they're getting a new element, but the radioactive decay shows it's not that. The chemistry shows it's not that. So they're getting the elements in the middle of the periodic table, which could not be explained. So there was a lot of, so the people were frustrated. They don't know what's the reason. They could not, that point of time, there was no theory to explain why is it so. Again, coming back to Lisa Meitner, so they also, so as I told, everybody was trying to understand that. Otto Hahn, Lisa Meitner, and Strassman, they work, this was a setup you can think of. It's about 1938. Lot of, this is a laboratory of Otto Hahn. And that time Meitner, another female scientist for that matter, very few fellows were there, very few women were working in science. She was one among them. Einstein used to call her as German Marie Curie. So she was at par with Marie Curie, maybe better in few cases because she has proposed many new theories. So therefore, this was a setup which they had, and this was a setup. Just imagine the setup. They were working and discovered one of the greatest discovery of the last century, the nuclear fission. So the idea, the Otto Hahn produced generated a lot of data, and the theory was proposed by Lisa Meitner. The concept of the word fission comes from her. So this was an example. So she when the idea, actually there's a lot of story in between that she, being a Jew, was sent out of Germany. She goes to Sweden, stays there. There's a lot of transaction between Otto Hahn and Meitner was happening through post those days, and a lot of data was exchanged, but he never understood why in the world is he getting barium or lanthanum for that matter. He was expecting the next element. Of course, the name was still not given at that point of time. Then she comes out with an idea. Yes, the thing that may be happening is uranium is becoming very unstable. It forms a compound nucleus of uranium-236, and it's so unstable, it breaks, it fissions and becomes two. And in this process, the news was very interesting because if you see the reaction, a typical reaction, when uranium is bombarded by uranium neutron, it produces fission products, barium, krypton, and neutrons. So you can see the neutrons are there. And she calculated each fission of 235 nucleus produces around 200 MeV of energy. It's a huge energy. In a chemical reaction, typically you come across EV region, and these are all MEVs. So the idea was, yes, then she comes out with a calculation and sees this is because of the mass defect. What is mass defect? You take the atomic masses of the reactants and the product, subtract the product from the reactant. You always see there is some amount of mass missing, and that mass comes in the form of energy, which is given by Einstein's E is equal to mc square. So the concept of fission was understood. This was kept secret. Of course, the data was not published. They were not allowed to publish. They were worried. See, the idea was whether this can be a source of energy, a source of future ideas. So it all happened in Germany. You're talking about 1938. The biggest connect between Europeans and Americans is this person named Niels Bohr. You know about him. He modified the Rutherford structure, atomic structure, and gave the stationary states and all that. So the idea of neutron, the idea per se of the fission, went to the Western world, that is Americans, through this character. This character is a very important character because he was a center of great research. Every big scientist used to come to his laboratory. He was working in Denmark. He had his own laboratory there. So he goes to US regularly, and there, when he goes there, he discusses with people that the concept of fission came, and this news reaches Fermi. Fermi was working in Columbia University at that point of time, and he immediately understood he could connect what he missed, and then beautiful. He thought whether is it possible to have a chain reaction. The neutrons are produced in the fission. Can it be used to sustain a reaction, sustain a chain reaction? If I can control that, I can harness huge amount of energy. So that was the idea. The Fermi is very quick. He could understand the discovery, and then he gets going in that. Meanwhile, in the backdrop of this, the World War was going on. Hitler was occupying every land possible in Europe. He almost occupied the whole of Europe. Till this point of time, America never came into picture until the Pearl Harbor happened. The moment Pearl Harbor happened, the people were panicking because now they understood that even America cannot be a mute spectator of the World War. It has to be part of it. and Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and now America has to take a step ahead and gets into the World War. Yet another three characters which are very important. You must have heard about few of them. All of them are Nobel Prize winners. Wigner has contributed a lot in material science, nuclear reactors, physics. Edward Teller is a father of hydrogen bomb. Szilard is one of the most smartest fellow you will come across in this story. His name is not well known until you come into nuclear chemistry per se. They are called Martians. They were all Hungarians. They all ran away from Europe because of the local issues, because they're all Jews. They all end up with America. America has become great because of all these Jewish people who contributed a lot to the science at that point of time. So Leo Szilard was very convinced that, he was so convinced that nuclear chain reaction is possible. So just imagine, he conceived the idea even before the concept of nuclear fission was discovered by Otto Hahn and Wigner. He conceived the nuclear chain reaction in 1933 and patented it. Just imagine, an idea to be patented, even nothing was even known. So then when the news of 1938 comes to Leo Szilard, he becomes uncomfortable. He knows the place where the discovery happened is Germany. Germany is ruled by a Hitler, and he knows the consequence of that. This can lead to disastrous consequences to the world if Germany can build up a nuclear bomb based on this idea what Otto Hahn has come up. And they were also sure, all these American, not only Hungarian scientists, all Jewish, they were very sure Germany had the best of them all, best of the people. Although a lot of fellows have got away from there. You take Einstein, he left Germany, but still people like Heisenberg were still there. They are still, although they may not be the followers of Hitler, but they are very, very connected to their own country. Therefore, if they were sure that if this idea, of course, Heisenberg will know that because they all work together. They know about Heisenberg. He's too smart. So they thought if this idea comes to them and if we don't do anything, we'll be in bad shape in future. So what Szilard does, the turning point in the history comes by this character, Leo Szilard. Leo Szilard knows that if he writes anything to the American government, nobody will care, nobody will bother. So the fission discovery happened on 17 December 1938. Szilard writes a letter. He goes to his closest friend, Einstein. Einstein taught him when he was in Germany, so they know each other well. He goes there. He says, "This I framed a letter, but I will not sign it. You sign it, and I will take it to the American government." So on August 2nd, 1939, just see, within 6 months, Szilard was so uncomfortable that he says something has to be done. America has to do something in this area if we have to get the weapon of mass destruction before Germany does. So he hands his letter to Alexander Sachs, a bureaucrat under Roosevelt, and nothing much happens there. So then, anyway, that story is altogether different. So then the American government takes over, and then they fund some money. We'll come back to that later. Meanwhile, this is 1938. Another scientist, which you must have heard or not, is by name Glenn Seaborg. Seaborg is one of the greatest scientists who worked in US in the last century. If you see the periodic table, the one man who discovered maximum number of elements is this person, Glenn Seaborg. Starting from Neptunium till Seaborgium, 108, he almost discovered 14 elements. No human being or no scientist has that much contribution to the periodic table as this person has. The name, the 108th element, the Seaborgium, is named after him. He was the only person when he was alive, his name we could see on the periodic table. There are many names, Curie's, Einstein's, and others, but they all got the fame only after they are dead and gone. But Seaborg could see his name in the periodic table when he was alive. That was a contribution. He was advisor to 7 US presidents. He was intended to become the atomic energy chairman. So what is his contribution? He was the person who discovered the so-called the element of the day, which we are discussing, the plutonium. Plutonium. So he was working in at University of Berkeley, California. So he, as usual, like any other people, he also wanted to extend the periodic table, wanted to discover the new element. So the first isotope to be discovered of plutonium is plutonium-238. I hope you all understand what is an isotope. Isotope is atomic number, just same atomic number but different mass numbers. Plutonium has many isotopes. One of them is 238. 238 is of no much great consequence except few applications. But how does it discover that? So what are the methods to produce the periodic table, extend the periodic table? You make the nucleus unstable by bombarding with neutrons or particles. As I was telling, the particle accelerator was discovered in the same laboratory by Ernst Lawrence. So he borrows that 60-inch cyclotron, bombards the uranium. So what is the target material? The material you want to use as starting material has to be the element which your last available element, that is uranium. Uranium has two isotopes, 235 and 238. Majority is 238. It takes natural uranium, bombards with deuterons. You know what are deuterons? Deuterons are nothing but the particle. The hydrogen has three isotopes. Two of them are stable, that is hydrogen and deuterium. Take deuterium, which has one proton and one neutron, strip the electron off, accelerate the particle in a cyclotron, take the particle and hit on a uranium. He observed the first element of the first, the first isotope of uranium, of plutonium, that is plutonium 38. So credit goes to him for the discovery of 238 plutonium, named after, as Aditi was saying, is named after the planet. At that point of time, it's a planet, no longer now. And they prepared. And similarly, the 239 is more important. As I told you, the most important isotope of plutonium which is used in atomic weapons is 239. How was it prepared? Again, the concept is simple. Take the 238 element. This time he bombarded with neutrons and waited for some time, and he could end up with plutonium 239. The last, you can see the picture on the right-hand side is the cigar box. This cigar box belonged to G.N. Lewis, the same person whom you know, because the dot structure of the sharing of the electrons is written as Lewis dot structures. His name is Gilbert Newton Lewis. He was nominated for Nobel Prize almost for 45 times, but nobody gave him. That's another story altogether, pathetic. He died in the laboratory because of hydrogen cyanide poisoning. And Seaborg worked with him for initial days of his career with G.N. Lewis. And G.N. Lewis was a human chimney almost. He used to smoke a lot. So his cigar box was one he used to store his flushed samples of milligram level amounts of plutonium oxide, which he prepared by using the bombardment of neutrons on uranium 238. Okay, now how does the plutonium? Now the world came. The problem is the plutonium was discovered in almost 1941. But the world never came to know about it almost for how many years? Almost 8 years, 7 years. Because after the World War I only, people knew that plutonium was produced, was discovered, produced in large quantities, and the end product of that was a bomb which was dropped on Nagasaki. So plutonium, what do you know about plutonium? Of course, this was atomic. There's a material which was used to destroy Nagasaki. The name goes as Fat Man because of the size of the shell they used to bomb it. Plutonium, what is interesting about plutonium? Plutonium, as I told you, was discovered. It's an artificial metal, artificial element made by man in the largest scale possible. It has 20 isotopes. 20 isotopes. Just imagine if you go back to Mendeleev days and thought that had the periodic table been the mass being the periodic basis of the periodic table, we would have had now around 2,500 elements in the periodic table. Luckily for us, the Mosley saved the day. He made the atomic number as a criterion, not the mass number. Therefore, we have only 118. So there are around 2,500 radioisotopes. That means an element with different mass numbers, and each of them is characterized well. So plutonium, if you take, it has 20 isotopes. Most important of them are 239 and 241. They are fissile. What is a fissile material? Fissile nucleus is a nuclei which undergoes fission or breaks into two with the production of large amount of energy, and by which you can sustain a chain reaction. And the requirement is also that the neutron which is hitting the nuclei should be a thermal neutron. Don't worry about it. Thermal neutron has the same energy as a typical KT at a given room temperature. Therefore, thermal neutron will have the energy of 0.025 eV. So if you take a material, if you can break the nucleus by using a thermal neutrons, you say that as a fissile material. So 239 plutonium is fissile and 241 is fissile. So these two are the commonly used fissile material in a nuclear bomb. But 241 is not available in nature. Therefore, 239 is the most commonly used fissile material. And plutonium-239 is also used as a fuel in fast reactors. Fast reactor is, what's the difference between fast reactor and a thermal reactor? Thermal reactor uses thermal neutrons, fast reactor uses fast neutrons. Don't worry about that, but it has advantages. Plutonium used in fast reactors can produce large amount of fuel. So that can be used to run multiple reactors. So therefore, the fast reactors are called breeder reactors. You can breed more material. Maybe if time permits, I'll tell you at the last. So therefore, plutonium is used in weapons. It's used in nuclear reactors throughout the world. How do you produce plutonium in a nuclear reactor? The beauty of this is you take in a reactor, you produce plutonium. You see this, you take uranium, the fissile material in most of the nuclear reactors. We have many nuclear reactors in the world. The most commonly used fissile material is the naturally available uranium-235. So what are the fissile materials available for us? One nuclei of uranium is 235, plutonium 239, and plutonium 241. 239 and 241 of plutonium are man-made. How do you make that? If you want to make in large quantities, this is the methodology. You take uranium, bombard with neutrons. When the neutrons, the beauty of this nuclear reactor is it also produces more neutrons. One of the neutron can be used to sustain the chain reaction. The other one can be used to get captured by 238. When you put the fuel in a nuclear reactor, out of every 100 nuclei, majority of them are 238, and they are not fissile. But they are called fertile. What do you mean by that? They are fertile because they can capture a neutron. You can see there, uranium-238 absorbs a neutron. It captures and becomes a compound nucleus of 239. That undergoes beta decay to give the next element, neptunium, and that undergoes decay to give plutonium. So in a nuclear reactor, when you start a reactor, you produce power, you also produce more fuel. And that's the beauty of a nuclear reactor. Nowhere in the chemistry you will come across a reaction where you get the product and more than the reactants. So that's something very unique about nuclear reactor. So in a nuclear reactor, you can produce plutonium-239 by the capture of the large amount of 238 available to produce 239. And this 239 has to be separated from the rest. And that's what a reprocessing plant does. The reprocessing plant separates uranium and plutonium. And this plutonium can have applications in further nuclear reactors, in fast reactors, or depending upon the purity of 239, it can be used for weapon grades. So plutonium, so it is the only synthetic element produced in large scale. When CVOC prepared in milligram level in 1941, when by the bomb we have bombed Nagasaki, we used almost a kilogram level. So milligram to kilogram level in a span of 4 years was possible. I think no other element has seen that much. So it was an alchemist's dream of transforming one element to another was realized in large scale because I'm able to convert uranium to plutonium. Plutonium is the most sought after isotope because it can make compact weapons, or the most dangerous element to be tamed in man. Because why is it dangerous? It's radioactive. It undergoes alpha decay. So if it undergoes alpha decay, you have to be very careful how you handle it. So, and how do you handle these elements? You handle in glow boxes or fume mode. Some of them you must have seen already. Because plutonium, you can't handle. There are two ways. If you want to handle a plutonium metal, let us come back to metal, then I'll come back to this. So what is the other unique thing about plutonium? Plutonium has 6 electrodes, starting from alpha, beta, gamma, delta, delta dash, epsilon. And it's very difficult to handle this metal because with temperature, with every change in 100 degrees, the form of the metal changes, the crystal structure changes. And the density variation is huge. It varies from 16 to 19. And this becomes very difficult. Let us say the Nagasaki bomb used plutonium metal. And if you have to machine a metal, you have to do some processes. And with every small change in temperature, there's a change in the form, it's not acceptable. So the machining is very difficult. So it becomes a nightmare for a metallurgist, not at all easy. So what do? That they stabilize one of the phases. One of the phases they stabilize is plutonium is delta phase. Between 300 to 500, they alloy with some other element, particularly gallium or aluminum or cerium, and make it stable and use that material. Therefore, pure plutonium is very difficult to handle. You can't do much with that. If you want to use that in a large scale, in a better scale, you have to alloy with something. So what are the characteristics of plutonium? It's like any other metal. They're all metals basically. The actinium series starting from actinium, thorium, protactinium, they're all basically metals. They're all silvery like any other freshly prepared metal. If you you reduce the corresponding oxide to the metal, you'll get a silvery material which tarnishes because they all react with oxygen to produce the corresponding oxides. They're hard and brittle like cast iron. It can be alloyed. You can make it softer. That's what they do. They make it softer and ductile by adding some elements like gallium. It has low melting point. We can see the melting point, but it has a very high boiling point. Very rarely you see a metal which has low melting point having a high. That means it has a huge span, basically, the liquid form. And it goes on decaying by alpha. For chemists, what is interesting? It's very, very interesting because the life of, if you see the periodic table, the s block elements are not very interesting for a chemist point of view because it can have an oxygen state of +1 or +2. Transition metals are very interesting. Take manganese, it varies from +2 to +7. The more the changes, the more the different forms it exists with, the chemistry becomes that much more interesting. Plutonium is another interesting element. If you see the configuration, the 5f, 6d, 7s orbitals are very close. Spectroscopically, we can prove that. And therefore, the transition, the electrons are available for bonding. And their orbitals are more diffuse, more directional in nature. And therefore, they participate in a lot of complex formation. So depending upon the oxidation state, you can see from +3, +4, +5, depending upon the complex oxidation state and the acid, you can have different variety of colors. It's beautiful in that way. So it's a colorful chemistry. It has variable oxidation state, and this is the basis on which I can separate. So when you saw that plutonium and uranium are there in the nuclear fuel, if you want to separate it, how do you do that? And it's a very challenging task to separate plutonium and uranium for two reasons. It's highly radioactive, and the chemistry is almost close. So using this oxidation state chemistry, a chemist tries to separate them, and they separate in large quantities in reprocessing plant by playing with these oxidation states. This is a typical glow boxes. Glow boxes are the closed containers which are connected to the exhaust, and it may be an argon filled or nitrogen filled, because plutonium, if you want to work on plutonium metal, it's very difficult because it will get oxidized unless you have an enclosure where you don't have oxygen. You have to produce setup, which becomes very costly. It's technologically, but that's the reason you don't see much of these things in a university level, because difficult to maintain. The laboratory should be designed such a way. Few modes are very common. If you go to any chemistry laboratory in the School of Chemistry, you can see organic chemists working on that. But here, what we have, if we come to Ajikar sometime, you can see that they have some few modes where the air cannot come from the other side. It has to be one way through, because even the small amount of plutonium can be handled in the fume hoods, but you have to be very, very careful. Handling plutonium is not at all difficult, because like any other metal, it's as poisonous as mercury, thallium, but the radioactivity makes it more interesting in the sense you have to be very careful when you handle. If you can handle it very comfortable, because it only produces alpha radiation. Alpha radiation can be handled, it can be cut by your gloves itself. So it's not difficult to handle per se. So this is the first plutonium reactor. The reactor was the amount of plutonium which was required for the production of plutonium in large scale was done at a Hanford reactor in the United States of America. And this was the bomb which was the plutonium bomb which was dropped on Nagasaki. The one which was dropped on Hiroshima was a uranium based. It was slightly thin, and they call it as little boy. This is the bigger one. It's called Fat Man. The principle is different, so I will not get into that. So if you see the isotope of plutonium, there are many, starting from 238, 239, 240. You see the variation starting from 88 years. The longest lived isotope of plutonium is 244. The one which we are interested in is 239 and 241. So these all can be made. Anyway, I'm not going to why plutonium 240 is called dirty plutonium. Maybe if you are interested, we'll discuss. So they have long half-life. So they can be handled very easily. But only thing you have to be careful. You require a special apparatus for doing that. 238, 240, 239, you know, is used for making you can make a fast reactor. You can use a nuclear weapon. 238 has a very interesting application. If you take 1 kg of 238, it generates 570 watts of power. So this is what is called, is used in radioisotope thermoelectric generators. This heat, you can see red glowing, nothing. It's because of alpha coming out. So many alphas are coming out. The alpha hits the material from which it is coming out, and the temperature increases and becomes so red hot. This is what is used in Curiosity Mars rover. What is the use of that? This heat is converted to electric power, and that electric power is what runs this rover, because you don't require high amount of energy. You require sustained amount of energy. With a half-life of 88 years, RTGs can produce power for a long time. Therefore, all the spacecrafts will have plutonium-238 as a source of heat, which is converted to electricity. Small, of course, we can't produce huge amount of megawatt of power. Of course, that is done in nuclear reactors. So this is what is used to produce power, which is used in spacecrafts. Of course, he is a person who headed the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project was so once the letter from Leo Szilard goes to American government, they start a project called Manhattan Project, which is headed by this iconic personality named Oppenheimer. Of course, you must have heard about Born-Oppenheimer approximation. Born was his guide. She is one of the greatest scientists at that point of time. The beauty is, he never won a Nobel Prize. and at least 50% of the people who are working with him are Nobel laureates. That's the greatness of this manager. You can see these are the people who worked with the Manhattan Project. Most of them are Germans, Jewish origin, and their aim was only to have a weapon before Germany gets it. You can see the names. The best of the fellows, the best of the brains worked on that, starting from Einstein, Bohr, Compton, Chadwick, Fermi, Rabi, Sagre, Chamberlain, Feynman, Schweitzer, Bethe. So all the great names were there. So therefore, the first nuclear chain reaction, the Fermi, the moment he understood that uranium can be used for producing a sustained chain reaction, he builds it one. He builds at the University of Chicago, where he was working under a small squash coat, and he constructed the first nuclear chain reaction on December 2nd, 1942, to show the world, yes, it's possible to use this nuclear energy in a nuclear reactor to produce power. Of course, the world came to know about the nuclear energy in the wrong way. The first explosion, the testing of the explosion happened in 1945 in New Mexico, and the first bomb was dropped within few days. July 16, 1945 was testing, and see the implementation. August 6, 1945, the first bomb on Hiroshima, the second bomb on Nagasaki. So that's the way when you say plutonium, the people always have shivers, because that's the world, the way they came to know about it. So there are the two bombs which are dropped in 1945 and in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nagasaki is the one which carried plutonium-based. It's nuclear energy. So once we understood, the Fermi showed it's possible to produce nuclear energy. So therefore, now you see the present form. 25% of the global energy comes from nuclear. Huge amount, 84 gigawatts of power is produced. They're all the future of the world, because they are green energy. They don't produce any carbon dioxide. The carbon footprint is going to be minimal. Of course, oil and gas are going to be exhausted. And in future, we have to depend on nuclear energy. At present, 25% is used. Let us see. So what are the options? What about India? Of course, we have to go for it. The huge requirement of the country, developing country, or the so-called getting developed, huge amount of energy is required for climate, for our industry. We also have to take care of climate. So long-term consequences, nuclear is inevitable. It has to add to our total recipe of our energy. So it has to contribute in a major way. What are the problems? Major problem is nuclear waste. The waste generated has to be taken care. It can't be just thrown like that. Safety, of course, safety is well taken care. You will hardly see any major disasters except Chernobyl and 3 Mile Islands, which if you study, it's more of a foolish ideas of trying to do an experiment which are not possible. Maybe I will suggest everybody to see the movie of Chernobyl, which was a web series, and it's a must for everybody to see what foolish things they do and the consequence the nuclear energy has to face in the long term. Public perception. As I told you, the world came to know about nuclear energy in the wrong way, therefore the perception is always bad. People think nuclear energy is only bomb. It's not true. Of course, there's a comparison. I'm not going to go into details. You require a very small area to produce the same amount of energy. If you take the hydel power plant, 2,000 to 5,000 hectares are required. If you take nuclear energy, the amount of land requirement is less. If you take the coal, the waste, the carbon dioxide emission are so huge. Nuclear will beat them left and right at any point of time because it's so clean. So fission, how does it happen? This we can see the animation. 235 is the fissile nuclei. It takes 235, becomes 236, unstable, it undergoes fission. You produce neutrons. That's the beauty. Your neutrons are the one which are coming out. You take that, it hits with another uranium nuclei, and it continues. So if you can, out of the two nuclei, out of the two neutrons are coming out, you continue the chain reaction, you get a sustained chain reaction. You can harness that energy. That's a nuclear reactor. If you don't control that, you end up with a nuclear bomb. That's the difference. A controlled chain reaction is a nuclear reactor. An uncontrolled chain reaction is a nuclear bomb. So this is basically fission. Same thing we saw before. So it's a chain reaction happening. So the first, as I told, after Chicago Pile, 1941, the first the nuclear reactor in large-scale production happened in 1951, almost after 10 years. So 1945, we have bombing. 1951, the peaceful use of energy in a large scale happened in EBR 1 in 1951. So therefore, if you take the nature, we have 238. Uranium has, in nature, we have only one fissile nuclei, that is 235, and this amount is very, very less. So if you want to increase the amount of 235, you have to enrich it. That's called enrichment. So that's another technology where you can produce high amount of 235 in a reactor. And 238 and thorium are basically fertile. You can convert them into something more useful. 238 can be converted to plutonium-39, and thorium-232 can be converted to uranium-233. So both of them are again fissile that can be used in the nuclear reactor. So the options available as a fuel is not many. 235 is the inevitable option we have. What about, so where do you get uranium from? In different parts of India, we get different locations, but the majority of them is coming from Jharkhand, where we have mines in Jadugoda, Bhatin. So this is a major source. If you see in India, uranium is not in large quantity, but thorium, of course, we are the largest in the world. So our idea is to use as much thorium resources as possible in future. So BAE has, Department of Atomic Energy has come out with a plan of how to utilize these thorium resources. How do you produce fuel? You start from Mother Earth is the major source of uranium. You convert, you from the mines, you convert into a form. You take the ore, you process it, you get uranium. From there, you convert to oxide form, because in the nuclear reactor, you require mostly the oxide is a form in which it is used. Then you put in the reactor. After in the reactor, you produce energy. You also produce good amount of plutonium, which has to be separated. Take that out, you reprocess it, and then again put back to the reactor. This is how a typical nuclear fuel cycle works, where uranium is mined, processed, plutonium is produced, and it continues. So this is the way it works. So you have a control chain reaction. You can see a nuclear reactor having a fuel. You have a coolant to remove the heat. You have a control rod to control the neutrons. Nuclear reactor is more of a controlling the neutrons. If you control the neutrons, you can do anything with that. So it's basically a controlled nuclear reaction, and you use control rods containing cadmium, boron to control the number of neutrons produced. Once the heat is produced, the right side of the thing is same thing as a thermal plant, where you produce steam. Steam runs a turbine. Turbine uses Faraday's principle to produce power, and the rest as it is. So this is basically how you convert fissile to fertile, fertile to fissile. 238 is converted to plutonium-239, and thorium is converted to 33 uranium. So these two again can be used in the nuclear reactor to produce power. So you have different power plants in India. We have around 30-35 reactors producing around 3% of the total energy. Some countries like France, Lithuania produce 70% of their power through nuclear energy. We have different reactors in India, starting from Tarapur, in Maharashtra, Rajasthan. Where I am coming from, Madras Atomic Power Station, we have two reactors, 2 into 220 megawatt, which caters the need of Chennai. We have Narora in Uttar Pradesh, Kakrapar, Kaiga, different parts. So in the world, if you see, America has around 100 nuclear reactors, China around 23, India is around 21. This is old data. So we have almost around 450 reactors in the world, producing around 30% of nuclear energy. Last few minutes, I'll see, when you talk about radioisotopes, uranium has, you take hydrogen, we have 3 isotopes. 2 of them are natural, that means they don't decay, hydrogen and deuterium. We have a third brother of uranium, hydrogen, which is tritium, which is radioactive. It undergoes decay to produce beta, gamma, and those isotopes have a lot of application. Where can I apply? Many places, medical applications, industrial applications. The point I want to drive is, when you talk about radioisotopes, it's not only uranium. There are 2,500 unstable isotopes in the whole periodic table, and out of them, 30% are useful for human mankind in a very constructive way. I just want to give the flavor. Of course, this I teach for 25 hours in our for the PhD students here, so that cannot be done now. But I will give a feeling of what are the isotopes, what application does these have other than the production of nuclear energy or a nuclear bomb. Its applications are in medical, industrial, agriculture, age determination, prospecting natural resources. I'll not go into all of them. Medical, of course, the medical imaging, yes, being revolutionized. Röntgen discovered in 1895, one of the greatest revolution in the human history, where you can find out the structure of a bone without cut opening it. Just imagine the life. You go to a doctor, we have a fracture, and he has to cut open and say that there's no fracture, there's a fracture. Now you just put your hands between the X-ray source and the machine and the film, you can get the picture, and you know it's very, very safe. And that will give a lot of information to the doctor to bandage it, to go for surgery and all that. Therefore, X-rays 1901, the first Nobel Prize in physics was awarded to William Röntgen. And this was the bubble from which Rudolf Becquerel thought it has some connectivity with X-rays, and therefore he goes on to discover radioactivity. X-ray, typical chest X-ray you must have seen. It gives the way the X-ray interacts with the body is different. X-rays are nothing but high energy and electromagnetic radiations. The way they interact with the material is different. It depends upon the atomic mass. The calcium, the bone interacts differently than the flesh, and therefore you can see the patches. And anybody having a fracture where you have a bit of flesh, you can see that as a crack in the picture, and therefore the doctor can identify and plaster it. The revolution, next revolution happened when these two guys from USA, Hounsfield and Comrak, they use the concept of CT scan. What is CT scan? X-rays used multiple times. When you use multiple time X-rays, you get an image instead of a two-dimensional image, you get a three-dimensional image. So X-rays were almost used for 100 years, almost. Then the concept of the CT scan, where you use multiple X-rays, of course you get more dose, but still okay, you don't give it quite often. And that gave a three-dimensional picture. It gave a lot of information about the part of the body you are assessing. Nuclear medicine. Nuclear medicine is the concept which was revolutionized by one more student of Rutherford. His name is George B. Havasi. He uses the concept of tracer. Tracers are used in many areas in research where you use a radioisotope instead of a normal isotope and try to trace the path of it. The idea was given by this person. It has a very interesting story. Now I will not get in because I'm already running close to my time. So what I will do is, so what is nuclear medicine? Nuclear medicine is a diagnostic, that means to find out the problem, and therapeutic, to heal the problem. What you do is you internally administer radioactive isotope to the person. X-rays, you stand between the source and the film. Here you give the medicine to the person which is radioactive. Is it dangerous? No, because the amount you give is very, very small. What is the advantages? It's huge. Just one injection, you can study several times without much radiation dose to the person. It gives the functional aspect of the organ. A tumor, let us say a person is having a tumor. What is the nature? Is it benign, malignant, location, size, functionality, in what stage you are? That will not be given by X-ray. X-ray will give only the size. The functionality is given by this new concept of nuclear medicine, which is called, I'll come back to that. What is it called? So therefore you have radiopharmaceuticals and imaging technique. This goes together. What do you do? You give a drug labeled with a radioisotope to the patient. And once it goes to the, what is the idea? You give a molecule which is specific for a given organ. Let us say you are trying to understand liver cancer. You should make a molecule, tag with one of the radioisotope which gives radiation, preferably beta and gamma, put in the body. What will happen once you put in the body? As you know, like if you take iodine, it goes to thyroid gland. Like that, you should specify, you should target an organ and then put that in the body. This goes to the particular organ. And based on the distribution of this molecule in the particular organ, the radiation coming out can be scanned and you can make an image out of it. Again, like something like a CT scan to get information about the location, the nature. How do I do that? What isotopes can you use? It depends upon the material the target you are working on. Chromium can be used for RBCs. So it has many applications. Let us say somebody wants to understand spleen. Spleen is a very small organ in the body, which is basically a dump yard or a graveyard of RBC cells. If you want to understand the metabolism of red blood cells, you have to understand what happens in spleen. So that means I have to use iron. Iron, I can't use normal iron. Iron 57 is stable. But if you use iron 59, yes, it can go to the organ spleen. And from there I can try to understand the behavior the iron is metabolized in the spleen. So depending on the problem, you have to choose the corresponding radioisotope, and using that you can do many things in the human body. And the greatest thing discovered, the artificial element, in fact this element is discovered even before the first neptunium was known. This is called technetium-99. Atomic number 43, the only element in the periodic table which is artificially made. Using this element, you can scan every damn part of your body, from brain, thyroid, lungs, liver, spleen, kidney. It's a miracle element. It's not found in nature. You have to make it. How do you make it? Same idea as what Seaborg used. Use the element before that, atomic number 42. Take molybdenum, put in a nuclear reactor, you get technetium. What's the advantage? It has half-life of 6 hours. Radioactive decay follows first order decay. So first order decay after 10 hours, it's gone from the body. So 60 hours, there's no technetium in the body. It gives gamma radiation, which can be scanned. It can be prepared from molybdenum. It comes below manganese. I was telling you, manganese and technetium have similar chemistry. They have similar chemistry. Their oxygen states are varies from +2 to +7, and therefore it can be used to complex many different molecules, and these molecules can be used for targeting a specific organ. So therefore, what they do once you put in the body, it goes to the. This is what you must have seen in a lot of movies. This is called a gamma camera. What do? You do the following: you give a injection with technetium to the patient, and this is specific for a particular organ. It goes to the particular organ in the body. Let us say for brain tumor, and that tumor goes on giving gamma radiation, which can be detected by the gamma cameras. And using the technology of computation, we can reframe the whole thing and find the location of the cancer. So therefore, basically, this is the simple methodology by which using radioisotope you can find out the location of tumor, and this is called single photon emitted computed tomography. Nothing complicated about it, because technetium 99 use only one photon, therefore it's called single photon. And this is tomography is basically, tomos is basically cutting the organ in a slices by using the gamma rays, and that will again the whole thing is repictured in the form of an organ, and therefore it's called computed tomography. So like instead of X-rays, now you are using gamma rays, the fag end of the electromagnetic spectrum. So that's basically how the tumors are found out in the body. Similarly, using different combinations, this patient is having now if somebody wants to study bone cancer, what they do, they use a technetium with a different molecule called diphosphonate. The moment you complex technetium with the diphosphonate, it goes and sits in the bone, and based on the cancer metastasis, you can find out the distribution of the cancer in the body, particularly in the bones, and then that gives a picture to the doctor. No, the doctor can do anything with that, is something he has to think of. If the tumor is something which is benign, it can be removed, it can go for chemotherapy, radiotherapy. So depending on the stages, doctor can, so it's a diagnostic tool basically to understand the location of the tumor in the body. So using technetium 99, you can scan any part of the body. The idea is use technetium with a good combination. The molecule has to be specific for the organ. So if it is specific for organ, as I was telling you, phosphonate is specific for bone. Like that, you can have specificity for a given organ, and using that, you can scan any part of the body. Great application for tumors. Similarly, we have another method called positron emission tomography. Something like instead of gamma, you produce positrons. Positrons have same mass as electrons, but they have different charges. Positive. The moment they come across electrons, they annihilate. They give two gamma rays in opposite direction, and these gamma radiations are what you detect, and that can be used to identify. They give better picture than SPECT, and therefore it has great applications. These are a typical. If you go to any big hospitals of Apollo or whichever we have, they have this is called medical cyclotrons. Because positrons are to be produced in situ, it cannot be made in a reactor. So this is basically a cyclotron, and using that they produce this positron emitting species, which can be used to scan and find out the location of the tumors using the so-called positron emission tomography. And what is the molecule which we used in that? It's basically FDG. FDG was called the molecule of the millennium in the last century. Fluorine 18 has a half-life of 110 minutes, around 2 hours. This is what is used to find used in PET scans. I'm not going to details. Maybe sometime next time when we have more time, we can discuss on this. So this is basically a FDG, that is a PET scan of a person having cancer. You can see the cancer is spread to many parts of the body. The one which glows is the one which gives the information to the doctor about the propensity of the cancer. So therefore, there are now two combo techniques where you can PET scan and CT scan. PET is for functional aspect, CT, conventional X-rays. Together, they give a great picture about the location of the cancer to the doctor. One single scan of PET can tell you whether a patient is having Alzheimer's or not. The problem with this disease is we don't have any treatment. We know it's there. You have to live with it. Therapy. Where else I can use radioisotopes? Cobalt-60, well known. The textbooks would have come across. Cobalt-60 is a gamma source for curing cancer by using external beam radiotherapy. Industrial application, huge applications. This is a big application. I'm not going to get into that. Let us say you want to fabricate a vessel with less defects. How will you find out? There's no defects in that or less defects. Use gamma radiation. So industrial applications is huge. You want to make a nuclear reactor vessel with minimum, they should have specified amount of defects. How do you find out? Using gamma radiography. Instead of using X-rays for human beings, we use gamma radiation for materials. Of course, C14, I'm not going to get. C14 is produced in the atmosphere by bombardment of neutrons from the cosmic radiation on carbon. You produce C14. C14 is assimilated by plants, and once the plant dies, the C14 is radioactive with a half-life of 5,000 years. And based on the half-life, we can find out the age of that particular plant. And based on that, the historians or the geologists can go back to the time frame to find out, understand where it belonged to, which era it belonged. It is not only carbon dating, you can also do the ratio of lead and uranium to find out the age of rocks, basically. Agriculture, you can use radioisotopes of phosphorus 32 to find out how much amount of phosphorus can be given to the plant so that it is healthy. Should not give too much because it may end up in bioaccumulation in the atmosphere. Therefore, the agriculture researcher will have a lot of understanding of the uptake of NPK fertilizers by using the corresponding radioisotopes. I was telling about the space applications, RTGs particularly. The Pluton-238 is used as radioisotopic thermal regenerators for continuous source of power, which can be used for converting that heat to electricity. And you see, people have sent in from 1969, 70s onwards. The Cassinian, which was sent in 1997, is still giving that power. In fact, recently only it was hit into Saturn. That power was sufficient to get the data into the base station at US NASA, and that is what is the beauty of 238 plutonium, to produce power, and that power is sufficient to run a rover type of material, rover type of thing. This is how the RTG looks, where the heat, using the Peltier and Seebeck effect, the heat is converted to the electricity, and that electricity runs the unmanned rover aircrafts. The last few slides, so this is a Russian nuclear power icebreaker. How does a ship basically run? What is the fuel? Let us say a ship goes to Antarctica. There's no fuel. How much fuel you can take with you? Normally ships run on kerosene, diesel, but these ships are running on nuclear reactor, a compact nuclear reactor, where the problem is you don't have to fuel it. You have to just control the nuclear reactor, get the power, and run these icebreakers across that Antarctica. And I think that's the end of my, I think I've taken slightly more than 1 hour. I was a bit fast because quite a few things to cover. And please, if you have any doubts, I'll be happy to answer them. Over to Aditi.
So thank you so much, sir. So since we are running short on time, I would directly go to the questions. Dear participants, if you have any questions, please raise your hand so that I can call your name and you can unmute your mic and ask the question. Mr. Utsav M has a question.
Yeah, please.
Sir, recently I was reading about external dependencies of half-life. For example, how, like, we studied in school that half-life is independent of temperature, pressure, and all that. But recently, there have been groups who have published data otherwise. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, this is quite a, people have been working on that. Is it possible to control the half-life? Is it half-life? As of now, as we understand, and people are working on different people are working on that, but it's not still substantiated. It's still in a very primitive stage of research where external agencies by temperature, pressure, can we control half-life? As of now, it doesn't look to be a very viable option as of now, but I don't know, maybe in future. But temperature, pressure, yes, it doesn't have great effect. Maybe small changes here and there, maybe possibility, but as of now, we have no theory to support that completely. Some data is there, but we have to wait for it and see whether it's really a true picture of that. So it's too early to comment on that, whether it can be, that means that the half-life can be controlled by external parameters, which looks to be very unlikely. Yes, as was told, there are some papers, people are publishing on that. It's like cold fusion. Remember that people have worked on cold fusion where they thought room temperature fusion is possible. But last 30 years, people are still working on it. Maybe you have to wait until it becomes a common phenomenon. But as of now, yes, we don't have much information on that, and we have to wait and see whether this really has any, is there any other parameter which is working, or we have to wait for it. I think still the data is not complete. Yes, maybe some research papers are there. Sure, I know that. But still a long way to say whether we can control the half-life by using some external parameters.
And if so, sir, any other promising ways to control nuclear waste?
Yeah, I think this is a common question which whenever we go across to many places, the point is, yeah, waste, of course, we handle it. When you do a nuclear reaction, you have, as I was telling you, once it undergoes fission, you get fission products, you get neutrons. You know neutrons can be used for sustaining the chain reaction. The fission products are the one which is a major concern. Now, I didn't well into that, the nature of fission products. Nearly half the periodic table, starting from germanium to dysprosium, half of the periodic table is there with that many isotopes. They say almost 500 isotopes are produced, but majority of them are half-lives are very small. A few of them have been separated and used. See, if you take cesium, cesium-137 is a radioisotope which is produced in nuclear fission. Good amount of material is produced. As I was telling, cobalt-60 is a one which is used as a gamma radiation. But we are running short of cobalt-60 because there are so many cancer patients, they require good amount of cobalt People are trying to see whether this nuclear waste can be a wealth from which I can extract something useful. I will not call it as a waste as of now, because a lot of things can be removed from there and can be having application. One such example is cesium-137. Cesium-137 is separated out in large scales. They are used in different applications of where gamma radiation. They're also trying to see whether they can substitute as a cobalt-60. Yet another isotope which is removed is strontium-90. Strontium-90 has application. Instead of using plutonium-238, Russians have used strontium-90. So what we are trying to do is whether you can remove as many things as possible. Still, you will end up with some waste. That waste is contained, is what you call is immobilized in glass and cement and stored in a very specific locations. So therefore, waste is a concern. We know that, and we know how to handle it. So that's not a major source of concern as of now. And you should see the pros of it. How much amount of waste I generate? The amount of the waste I generate as compared to coal plant is minuscule, very, very small quantity. Yes, it's radioactive waste, therefore it has to be handled with care and it is taken care. The technology is available, throughout the world people are working on it, and therefore the waste is taken care in the same location where it is produced. So therefore it never goes out of the terrain from where it is produced. So nuclear waste is something we know how to handle it. So there should not be a source of concern.
Thank you, sir. This answers my question.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah.
You said that like technetium, that element you can be artificially created. So like, is it like any element in the periodic table can be created using the previous ones?
Very good. That's a beautiful question, because see, you remember alchemists. Alchemists were the so-called chemists with a lot of crazy ideas. They want to convert every damn metal to gold. They want to live long. Therefore, they thought there should be some material. If I gulp, I can live longer. Of course, the second part was taken care, because there are medicines by which at least you can increase your longevity to a certain extent. Antibiotics, drugs. But this conversion of metal from, as you said, if I can, is it possible to convert? Okay, let us see. Which is the most craziest metal people have sought after now? Maybe okay, with no offense, gold is one people are crazy about. Now, if you take the previous element of gold, what is the atomic number of gold? 79. Now, if you take platinum, of course, platinum is as costly as gold. So, in fact, it's costlier than gold. So, if you take that material and put in a nuclear reactor and convert it, will that be a viable option? You can convert it, but the cost will be so exorbitantly high, it's not worth it. Technetium is not available in nature because its half-life is very, very short. Had it been produced also, it's no longer available. So, therefore, producing, the nature gives the cheapest thing. The best of the world is always free. Air, if you just imagine to produce oxygen from dissociation of water by electrolysis, it's not easy. So if you want to produce an element, it's only worth it if it's worth the cost. Otherwise, the cost you are going to put to convert that element is going to be exorbitantly high. Technetium, plutonium, why people are using, why did I go to plutonium then? Yes, because I want it, because it has a destructive power. I want to use the power for my control. And that's the reason people have gone for that. So any material can be converted in principle in a nuclear reactor, but the cost is the one. If it's going to be very 10 times costly, it has no meaning. So that's the point. So you can convert in principle any element in a nuclear reactor. Basically, you have to play with the nucleus, either with protons or neutrons, and produce the element. But the cost of separation, cost of the other materials which are produced, from which you have to separate, is going to be exorbitantly high. So the best thing is go back to nature. What nature gives is the cheapest.
So also one more question I had, which was, you said those two scientists, when they're working with uranium, like bombarding it with neutron, they found barium and krypton were forming. How did they know that those two elements were formed? Because I like basic analysis, like doing basic ion tests like that, or like.
Yeah, no, good. That's a good question. As a chemist, that's a very interesting question. Okay, krypton is a gas, so therefore gas is not an issue. They were, see, when you do a fission, the beauty of this fission is you take any reaction, A plus B, you take in any organic chemistry reaction, A plus B giving C and D, you may get 2 products, 3 products. 2 of them are side products or the products which are not required by you. One is the one which is major, which you are interested in. So maybe you get 2 byproducts, maybe 3. If it is more than 3, you will not even do the reaction. It's not worth, because your yield of the metal of interest will reduce. But in a nuclear fission, you get damn half the periodic table. So how am I going to separate it? So therefore, when they found, they were getting, see, at that point of time, you should think of 1930s. Now we have a lot of gadgets by which I can find out the radiation very, very easily. At that point of time, they were all trying to understand. So basically, how to separate things you have to do something based on difference in their chemistry. If they belong to two different groups, it's easy because the chemistry is different. So what they were trying to do is they were trying to understand that they were doing something called precipitation or specific preferential precipitation of fraction crystallization. So they were not at that point of time, they didn't have any high-fi technologies. Purely based on the solubilities, they were trying to understand. So they were doing something called co-extraction. So they understood, they thought if it is uranium chemistry is if I had bombarded, chemistry will be something similar to uranium because it's next neighbor. But they were finding out they were getting a solid white material precipitate, and their chemistry was, because barium salts are well known, their chemistry was similar to barium and lanthanum. So therefore, they were the most of the method by which they understood that is the basic chemistry was precipitation. So using the precipitation method only they were working at that point of time. Even the radium separation was done by precipitation. The whatever Horn and Strassman worked was more on precipitation. Irene Curie there was more of chemist contribution to the fission than the physicists.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Now Mr. Siddharth Sahu has a question.
Yeah.
Sir, when nuclear fuels are used in ships for powering the engine or anything like that, so how is the total energy controlled? Because the amount of energy produced in a chain reaction is very huge, which is even more than the energy which is used for just running a ship. So
Yeah.
how is the
Yeah.
whole thing controlled inside?
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I got your point. See, when you take a nuclear reactor, you produce 220 megawatts. We have reactors which are 1,500 megawatts. So what should change when you go from 220 megawatts to 1,000? The amount of the fuel, the material.
Yes,
yeah. So similarly, when you want to run a ship, you know how much amount of, ultimately what, it has to run the turbine, correct? It has to move the, if you've seen the movie Titanic, you would have seen, they used to use coal to produce power, and that will run the ship. You remember that? So similarly, here you have to produce power to run the turbine. So power is, you have to calculate how much amount of power is required for how much time is required. So therefore, based on that, you have to calculate how much should be the core of your nuclear fuel. So therefore, they calculate that accordingly for the power for the given output, and then they calculate. Therefore, you depending upon the usage, the amount of the uranium fuel required will vary. And therefore, you'll be amazed that the size of the fuel required, the amount of the fuel required for a typical maybe a nuclear reactor or for a ship or for a submarine. People use a lot of things submarine. Is very, very compact, because uranium is a compact source of energy. So much amount of energy is there. So coming to our question, they calculate that, they back calculate and find out how much amount of the fuel is required. Let us say to run for the ship is going offshore for 2 years. That much amount of the fuel is taken in the form of the what you call oxide fuel or silicide they use, and that is what is used. Therefore, something like a petrol you have to fill depending on how long you are going. That much amount of the fuel is taken care and given. The size is typically of like a small suitcase. They say I have not seen that, but it's very, very small, compact reactor. If you have gone to a ship, if you have gone to the basement of the ship, huge amount of fuels is required, because if you want to run for 1 year, just imagine the amount of diesel that required. This becomes very, very small. So the calculation is done based on how much is the usage, how much is the time you require, and based on that, the fuel is put or removed.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
I think a follow-up question is asked by Advait Thakkar. He asks that what happens to the nuclear waste generated by the Russian nuclear powered icebreaker?
Yeah, so what they do is, see, the point is this nuclear reactor, once you put the engine, it has this fuel, it runs. Once, let us say, it comes back to the base station, they remove that suitcase containing the fuel. And what they do is they again reprocess it. They separate it out because the fuel is not completely burnt. Let us say you've taken 50 kg of uranium, all would not have burned. But I can't use this for the next run of the ship. So I will take it out, reprocess. That means I separate this uranium and take the uranium again, add some more uranium to that, make it again into the form what is required and put back in the reactor. So therefore, like you go to petrol bunk to fill the petrol, this has to be done at the shores where they do something called a chemical separation, and again put the fuel back into the reactor and into the compact reactor, and so the ship goes back to the place where it is belonged.
Yes, sir. I think that answers the question.
Yeah.
Okay. So, sir, I hope you don't mind if I be rude enough to ask a little some questions which are not so welcome with respect to nuclear energy.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I have this question that plutonium is known to be a potent inhalation carcinogen. And people also say that the carcinogenity of plutonium is actually seriously underrated. So, commercialization of plutonium to produce energy, do you think it should be acceptable by society?
Okay, fine. That's a very good question, Aditya. What I will give you a small exercise for you. You go to a chemistry laboratory tomorrow. Take any organic solvent, starting from benzene, as innocuous as benzene, and see its label. All of them are potential carcinogens. So when it comes to plutonium, we always have this fear. But I will tell you, I've been handling for quite some time. When you handle plutonium, it's far more easier for two reasons. Because you're very conscious about it, that you want to be safe. So therefore, that solves most of the problems. Most of the accidents happen in any laboratories because of the carelessness. The moment you handle it in a fume mode or a glow box, which is an enclosed system, and where I also have a badges holding on my shirt to tell me how much dose I take. So unless and until I gulp it, I take into the body by some route, by inhalation, ingestion, or whatever method, it's absolutely safe. It's as safe as mercury. Mercury is far more dangerous if it goes internally. You must have seen the history, Minamata disease and all the stuff. So every element will have its own problems. The moment you tame it, you know how to handle it carefully, you give the due respect it deserves, it can be handled. Whether it's carcinogenic or not, 90% of the chemicals you're handling are carcinogenic. And we don't even know what are the causes. Absolutely. Yes, plutonium, the radiations are harmful. If it goes inside, it can cause cancer. Nobody denies that. But you have to handle it carefully. When you do any handling, for that matter, in the laboratory, even as innocuous element as acetone can catch fire and can destroy the whole lab. So it all depends on how you handle it. If you can handle it carefully, comfortably, I don't see any reason. And yeah, coming to carcinogenicity, just how much do I handle at any point of time? There is a restriction. I don't handle tons. I will handle milligrams, micrograms. As a chemist, I don't require much. Yes, in a plant, I require kilograms, but do they handle with naked hands? Everything is remotized. It's all done by something called a master slave manipulators. You are there away, almost few feet. You don't handle with your hand at all, large scale quantities. The point is how to handle it. Yes, you should be careful. It can be carcinogenic if you don't handle properly. But if you see the history of the radiation workers who are working, the statistics of the cancer is as good as the local population you have. So it's absolutely safe.
Okay, sir. Yes, sir. So one more question which I would like to bring up is, why was the dirty plutonium named that way? You mentioned in the talk that you would be answering it.
So I didn't get into that because if you want to make something, so when you want to detonate something, you want to make as an explosion, you should have control on it completely. Plutonium-240 also, as I was telling you, all these radioisotopes disintegrate by giving alpha, beta, gamma, neutrons. There's one more mode of decay or disintegration which happens beyond 2094, beyond the post-plutonium elements, americium, curium, californium. That's called spontaneous decay. Spontaneous decay is what? See, when you take uranium nucleus and hit it with neutrons, you make compound nucleus and it undergoes fission. How will you control this fission? By controlling the neutrons. But if you take plutonium-240, whatever way you prepared it, it has a tendency to decay on its own without even neutrons. That means what? It is not at all comfortable in 240. That neutrons to proton ratio is not at all comfortable. So what it does is it goes on giving neutrons. And neutrons is not something which I don't want, because these neutrons, if I don't control, it can pre-detonate. That means that bomb can fizzle out even before I really want it to explode. So this plutonium-240 has good amount of neutrons produced even otherwise without using fission. And therefore 240 should be avoided. So the bomb grade plutonium should have less than 7%, beyond less than 7% of 240 is allowed. Beyond, if it's more than 7%, you can't use that plutonium mixture of 239 with 240 for a bomb. So therefore it's called dirty plutonium, and it's very, very difficult to separate it out. Therefore there are methods by which you can separate it out. You have to plan your nuclear reaction in such a way, because you can't separate once it is formed. So therefore you have to classify this. The name comes because if you have 240 in quantities, I can't control the explosion. There's something called pre-detonation, which is not what you call warranted, and that's the reason you call it as dirty plutonium.
Okay, so it's more like it behaves in a dirty way, so they call it dirty plutonium. It's very
Exactly.
bad question. Yeah.
Yes, and that's correct. That's the way, because I don't want it. I don't want that fellow to be there, but it is there. So what to do? So that's why we call it dirty plutonium.
Okay, sir. Okay, so Mr. N. Ramchandra also has a question. Please ask your question, sir.
Sir, if I bombard calcium, which has atomic number 20, with einsteinium, which has atomic number 99, will I get a new element with atomic number 119? Is it possible?
That's it, exactly. See, now the question is, I can extend the periodic table from uranium, neptunium, put the neutrons on uranium, you get neptunium, put neutrons on neptunium, you get plutonium, put neutrons on plutonium, you get americium. Can I go on forever? At some point I cannot, because neutron addition will not help. Then I have to bombard with the particles, with charged particles, like Seaborg did by bombarding the uranium with deuterons. Same thing is being used. If I want to produce, let us say, 118th element, 117th element, what will I do? I have to take a target material, as you said. What is the target material? Take the one which is available in large quantity. Let us say americium, and then you hit with let us say calcium, as you were saying, rightly saying. You can produce calcium 2 plus, 3 plus, 20 plus. I can strip all the electrons present, and I can bombard this calcium on a target material. The problem is this: once it gets into, let us say, americium, you told something. Yeah, if I take those two. Now, once it forms a compound nucleus where this calcium is submerged into the target material, there are many paths by which it can decay, and very, very small quantity will be the summation of it. So therefore, the problem is, had the life been that easy, you would have produced 100 more elements by now. But once it forms a compound nucleus, there are many modes of decay. The most common is to undergo fission, spontaneous fission, and 1 in a million or 1 in a billion or even 1 in that, even smaller than that, you may get the added product of new element. So therefore, producing new element is not just that easy. Of course, the methodology they follow is the same thing. You have a projectile hitting a target. Target should be something which is a large atomic number, and whatever you want to make that total proton number, you can try. But it's just not the summation. And therefore, once it forms a compound nucleus, can give variety of exit paths, and one of them may be this. And that's the reason you hardly have 1 or 2 elements in a decade. So the methodology is what you said is right, but the product will not be as easy as you think.
Sir, one more question, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, how uranium bomb is different from plutonium bomb?
Okay, fine. I didn't get into that. So the uranium, say when the bomb, say how do you make something critical? So when you say a reactor is critical, say when you say person is critical, you understand he's on the deathbed. When you say reactor is critical, that's a problem. People think it's something bad or something is going to happen. Nothing to do with that. Reactor is critical when it starts producing power. That's what I call it critical. And that's the problem, that people also use the jargon, and when you say the reactor is gone critical, people worried whether what will happen to the reactor, will it explode? No. So when you want to make something critical, means the reaction is happening. So let us say if you want to put a bomb on Nagasaki, when they did on Hiroshima, the idea was you take 2 hemispheres together, you go to the location where you want to detonate and fuse them. Once you fuse them, you reach a critical mass, you explode. That's what they do in the uranium type of reactor, uranium type of bombs. They call it as 2 hemisphere and fuse it. But in the case of plutonium, this did not work, because plutonium 240 was what do you call it, was pre-detonating it. There's a probability that plutonium 240 can act dirty and can pre-detonate. And that's the reason what they do is they make a hemisphere, they make a spherical what you call material of critical mass slightly less than that, and they do something called implosion. The principle on which the physics of the detonation in both the cases are different, and therefore the plutonium they were not sure will work, and that's the reason the New Mexico they tested before putting the bomb. The Hiroshima one was very clear; they know it will work. So the principle on which they work are the based on the material. You have to choose the appropriate path. Either you have uranium based or plutonium based. Plutonium is uranium is 2 half hemisphere fusing together, and the plutonium is called implosion based devices. So let us not get into details of that. It may not be of much consequence here. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Any other question?
Yes, sir. Okay. So again, Prateek has another question. He wants to ask that it's a more elaborate question.
Yeah.
So he is asking that when these radioactive materials release alpha particles, let's say we keep the material in vacuum chamber. So do these alpha particles stay back normally in the chamber, or do they react or get absorbed into anything to become when it comes in contact with them?
No, you're talking about which alpha particle? When is this situation?
I think Prateek is referring to a general reaction where you take when you use alpha particles, maybe any reaction when you
See, when the modes by which a nuclei undergoes decay is alpha particle. Alpha particle is nothing but a helium nuclei with no electrons. So therefore, if you take uranium resources, you will always see uranium has a half-life, it decays. So when it decays, it gives alpha particles. When the alpha particle comes out of the nucleus, they take electrons from the surrounding and they become helium gas. And therefore, once the helium is coming out, its energy is quite high in the region of MeV, but it's too heavy, so it cannot travel. Within few millimeters in air itself will be stopped. So helium handling, the alpha particle handling is very, very easy. No issue at all. That's the reason plutonium is easy, because plutonium uses alphas, and alphas do not penetrate into your body. What is more dangerous for the human body is going to be gamma radiation, because gamma has higher penetratability. It can pass through, and that's the reason you should be more careful. Helium is very innocuous. It's heavy. It can't move. The moment it comes out, it takes electrons from the air and it becomes helium gas. So absolutely no issues. Helium handling is very, very easy. Alpha particle is easy. Followed by beta. Beta is a fast moving electron. It's lower energy, so it can travel more. Gamma radiation is like a light. It can penetrate. So it has to be controlled, means you have to use something called a shielding material. So depending on that, therefore alpha in that way is very innocuous. We can handle it very, very easily.
Great. I didn't knew that technically. Yeah. So there is a little open question by Shivanu Saurabh. He asks that in recent times, many claims say that cow dung can be protective against radiation. So is it just pseudoscience or is it something relevant?
Absolutely pseudoscience and nothing else. Full stop. What can be cow dung contain? Let us, if you elaborate as a chemist, it can be all the elements of low Z material. See, human body always carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus maybe. And how can this technically, if you see, if I want to control the radiation, the interacting material should have high mass number. Therefore, people commonly use lead. Lead is the shielding material. High Z material, high atomic number. You can use gold. Of course, I don't have that much gold. Therefore, I use lead, which is available in large quantities. So high dense material, high atomic number material is the one which I should use. If I use cow dung, only God can save.
Okay, sir. So Yamini Malhotra was asking that can you also share your PPT with us?
Sure, I will pass on to Aditi. You can always feel free to contact me and anything in future. I'll send her email also. My email ID to her. Anytime you can feel free to call for anything, whatever you want. Absolutely no issues.
Okay, sir. Great. So Yamini, you can actually email us to the Junior Science Club email ID, and we will forward you the PowerPoint presentation and contact.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one more question by Anmol R. It was already answered by the comments by someone else, but I would like to highlight it again. So can someone give some hint about how X-rays and CT scans take place? You did mention it in your talk, but please answer it again for the sake of the question.
How are X-rays produced?
No. How does this X-ray and CT scan take place? Like, how do they take images of our environment?
Yeah, got it. Maybe I was a bit fast. So X-rays, as I told you, is produced whenever you have a fast electron bombarding a high Z material. People use tungsten, molybdenum. When they hit that, you produce X-rays. And X-rays have many applications, particularly for the one which you used for human beings, they're called soft X-rays. If you take these X-rays and you, let us say, you take, when you stand between the photographic film and X-ray source, you get two-dimensional picture of the X-ray. But if you want a three-dimensional picture, what should you do? What I do is like a photograph you take from 3 dimensions. When you take your selfies in all directions, like that, you have to take selfies in 360 degrees. So when you take that, you get the information in that particular angle or direction. You take all these pictures, you mathematically combine it and get a 3-dimensional picture. So CT scan has nothing to do with X-rays. I can use gamma rays. I can use, in the case of SPECT, when you use technetium 99M, I use gamma radiation. of 160 MeV, 140 MeV, 140 EV. So when you use X-rays, you're using X-rays. But X-rays may be less energetic than gamma rays. So CT scan is more of a mathematical formulation where computer tomography. I use computer to tomograph. Tomos is basically slicing. I'm slicing that part into different parts and then use each of these parts to produce the full picture. Therefore, CT scan is nothing but a successive X-rays taken to get a three-dimensional picture of that particular organ you are interested in.
Okay,
Yes.
sir.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question well. So maybe we could wrap up this session here. But before wrapping up the session, I would like you to briefly give us some more information about your own career journey and path, how you came to this field, and how has your life been after choosing this career?
Okay, okay, and I'll just a few words I'll use that. So, okay, as I told, I did my graduation BSc Chemistry honors from Delhi University, and then did my masters from. I joined Delhi for IIT Delhi for MSc, but my father got transferred to Hyderabad. Therefore, in Hyderabad, I joined Hyderabad Central University. So I was a day scholar for that information because I used to shuttle almost from one end of Hyderabad to the other end. I did my masters there, and then I joined BR, that is DAE, BRC through training school examination. If somebody is interested, I will tell you how to get into that if you are interested. Otherwise, maybe maybe you know how to go do the PhDs and PDFs outside the country. But if you're really interested to get into DAE, DAE is a very what I say is a great place to work. A lot of freedom to work. You can do so. After my masters, I joined there in Bombay for 1 year. After 1 year training, I come to Kalpakkam. Last 25 years, I am here. Did my PhD afterwards from Madras University. And then then we also have our own university. So one thing is, after MSc, if you're really desperate for a job, DAE is not a bad place at all. Because after PhD, PDF, coming back, settling down, it takes its own time. Of course, you must see in your faculty, they're doing great work. But if you want something urgent because of the home problems and all that, then you can think DAE as a career. Of course, the way you get in is the competition is huge. Every year we take maybe 10 students throughout India. So the competition is 1:1000. How do you get in? Based on your, you can write your GATE examination, get into first above 98 percentile, or you have to write if you don't qualify that, you can write our exam followed by an interview, a rigorous grilling interview, which can go from 2 to 3 hours, where they really find out your basic understanding of the subject. So one way to get into this DAE is that means you can join after masters, and after masters, this is a good job in that way because you can do the research depending on where you are placed. We have different research institutes throughout India. BRC, as we all know, is one major institute, followed by IGCAR, where I come from, Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research. Based on the position in your the so-called that's called training school, like School of Chemistry. You are trained for 1 year. Based on your performance in the class, you have an option to choose the place. Let us say you have the topper, you have 10 options to choose from. So you can choose where you want to work in. And we work on many areas of chemistry, starting from biochemistry, technology, organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, material research, huge. So in that way, we have a lot of options. So once you get in, then you can complete. Now we have our own university called HBNI, Homi Bhabha National Institute. We can check in the website. That university started 15 years ago, but we are doing great now. And I am a faculty there. I also teach there. I'm also Dean of Chemistry right now. So I also have students who I guide for PhD. So therefore, what I'm saying is, it's a great career if you want to get in. Of course, other options are, HCU means always you think of research. Yes, think about that. But I'm saying this also we require. The pathetic part is this year or last 5 years, when we were in the committee, I could not get a single student from Southern India. And that's where the problem is. See, we also have an association called, I was under the banner where we speak. Nobody wants to come to chemistry. One of my best students is Sarah, because she was with me for so many years. And she is one of the reasons she went to chemistry is because of me. I hope she will do well there. But I know. But what I'm saying, chemistry is a great option. People don't think as a career. People think only engineering, particularly if you're coming from four southern states, the life begins from being in engineering and ending a doctor. So these are the only two career options. It's not true. Having taken chemistry, get into that. Yes, if you go to research, it may take more time to settle down. But there are other options. You can go for teaching. We require good teachers in the country. We don't have good teachers. If you want to earn, yeah, go to Fiji and start teaching. You'll earn better. Point is, what do you want to be happy with? You want to do research? You can come to IGCAR, come to DIE, you can do research and can teach. Yeah, money part may not be as great as Fiji if you're where people earn in crores. I don't know. That's what people say. So what I'm saying is, you have the knowledge. The sky is the limit. Earning is not a problem. You want to become famous, you do good work, you will become famous. So it all depends on what you want. And in the era where you have every material on the internet to become good and bad, we have great teachers. Or you go to NPTEL lectures, you have every damn lecturer teaching the IITians teaching you. Crave for knowledge, try to understand. If you understand, don't ever read for marks. I never read for marks. My highest percentage in MSc maybe 64%. I was all India topper for my entrance exam, not for the MSc first year or second year. So in that way, what I'm saying is always try to go for the knowledge, try to understand, have that knowledge. When you get up in the morning, try to see what I learned something new. Have I learned something new? Will I learn something new? Don't waste too much time on this WhatsApp and Facebook. It's going to only waste your time. By the time you realize it's too late. So keep working, keep reading, keep working on the hobbies of reading. Because if you're going to put into research, your job is to read for half of the day at least. So that's going to be there. So what I'm saying is, chemistry is a great option. Please continue that. And anything you require, the future opportunities, please feel free to contact me. Whatever we have information, I'll share with you. But think about it, but start thinking. You people are all in second years and third years, so maybe it's a high time. What's the next thing? And have a target on a daily basis. How much, what is the target? The journey, how much I will take to reach there. All these things are available. A lot of material is there. If you want to read and understand, absolutely no dearth of material by the best teachers, by the best professors, the best books available. When I used to read, the best book of organic chemistry was Finar, a drab book of black and white. But it's a good book, but you don't feel. Now you go to the organic chemistry, you have hundreds of books, each colored. You feel like reading it. So absolutely, it's a huge transformation in the books available, the knowledge available. Teachers anyway are teaching you. So the concept is, when the teacher teaches you, try to understand it, try to understand the logic of that, try to complete that concept that day. Try to go to the net, try to see whether somebody can teach you still easier. And at the end of the day, you try to teach something. When you sleep, just see whether you can teach the same concept to somebody in a legible way. The moment you realize that you are able to teach as well, or you are satisfied, that means you learned the concept. You are not understood until you have taught somebody. So that's the motto. Keep understanding, keep enjoying chemistry. I think that's the best thing happened, at least for me, and I hope it continues to happen to you. That's it, I think. Thanks. Any other questions? I'd be happy to take.
I think we have answered all the questions, sir. And that was a great message to end the talk and wrap up the session. So I'll be going towards the vote of the thanks, and in case anyone has a question, they can drop the question in the chat box. Okay, so on behalf of the Junior Science Club, I would like to extend my hearty thanks to the Honorable Speaker of the Day, Professor CVR Ramananda Rao, who shared his virtual presence and took out his valuable time with his busy schedule to share so much knowledge with us. I must mention my deep sense of appreciation for our fellow senior coordinator, Sara Jivo, for approaching Sir on our behalf. And I would also like to wish and express my gratitude to the Director of CIS, Professor Sanjay Subodh, and Associate Director, Professor Krishnaveli Mishra, for providing us this opportunity to organize webinars during the pandemic. I'm very grateful to all the faculty coordinators. Some of us are also in the meeting right now: Professor S. Ilangovan Sir, Professor Muralidharan, Professor Srinath, and Professor Sharmishta Banerjee, for their constant presence, guidance, and valuable encouragement. And as no event is successful with one single person, so I would like to extend my thanks to all my fellow coordinators, CIS office members, and my dear audience for participating in this webinar. Thank you for making it a great success.
Okay, thank you very much. Signing off.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.